In my marriage with Jacob, everything seemed, as I thought, right. We valued each other, made plans, and laughed at the little things. He was attentive, patient, and we had a strong foundation. But no matter how I tried to explain it, I still missed something barely perceptible. Those surprises. Those little things that could shake up the usual order. I talked about it with Jacob, but although he agreed, he clearly didn't share my enthusiasm for changes. He was loyal to our daily routines, where cozy dinners and watching movies together had become unspoken rituals. When Jacob announced that his younger brother Kevin would be staying with us for a few months, I received the news with a touch of surprise, but also a spark of interest. Kevin was a half-forgotten story for me, someone Jacob rarely talked about. He simply explained that Kevin needed some time to settle in the city and find a job, and that we could offer him a temporary refuge. Kevin arrived late at night. I remember how the soft glow of the lamp lit his face as he walked in. Tall, with a calm and confident posture, he left a first impression similar to a barely noticeable breath of fresh air. In his dark, calm eyes, there was something elusive and mysterious that caught my attention almost immediately. There was something simple yet unfamiliar about him that immediately set him apart from the familiar faces in our everyday life. Jacob hugged him with a warmth he rarely showed, and I noticed how his eyes lit up when he met his brother. They quickly started talking, while I watched from the sidelines, feeling slightly out of place. Kevin seemed friendly but kept his distance. He didn't speak much, gave short but warm responses, occasionally casting quick glances at me when Jacob wasn't looking. It was as if he was trying to understand who I would be to him in the coming months. We exchanged our first formal phrases, and though he was polite, Kevin remained a bit detached, like someone accustomed to being on his own. I noticed a special confidence in him, bordering on a slight nonchalance, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what made me linger on his face longer than I should. Just a few days had passed since Kevin moved in, but it felt as if the house had taken on a new shade. Kevin behaved calmly, not trying to disrupt the established rhythm. He was unobtrusive and always maintained order. Yet this ability of his to blend into the shadows seemed to add something new to our daily rituals. He was there, but it felt as if he could disappear at any moment just as suddenly as he had appeared. Every evening we gathered for dinner, where Jacob seemed to have gained a new spark in life, trying to make up for the lost years of connection with his brother. Time at the table filled with laughter, memories, and stories that, under other circumstances, I might not have heard. Jacob talked more than usual, his eyes shining when he spoke about work and new plans. I suddenly realized that I was seeing a different side of him, more lively and open than I was used to. Kevin usually sat across from me. His manner of carrying himself, confident and relaxed, sometimes made me wonder what events left that mark of detachment on him. His movements had a grace unusual for his age. He wasn't arrogant. On the contrary, he was always polite and courteous. But try as I might, there was always an invisible boundary between us, stirring a growing curiosity in me. I couldn't help but notice that with Kevin's arrival, my own thoughts began to drift in unfamiliar directions. Each of his glances, which accidentally lingered on me longer than usual, seemed to make me look at myself differently. With Jacob, everything was calm and stable, yet sometimes I felt an elusive loneliness. Now, this loneliness seemed to retreat. Kevin's presence wasn't so much a filling of the void as it was a reminder that I could feel differently. In the mornings, I noticed his habits, how he always got up early to exercise on the terrace, how he neatly folded his things, as if every detail was important. He didn't care about luxury or unnecessary words, and perhaps this was what fueled my curiosity. Jacob often left for work before us, and in such moments, I found myself alone with Kevin over leisurely breakfasts, where the silence felt as meaningful as words. When he accidentally held his gaze, I felt a vague anxiety. Like a spark, this feeling made me wonder what it was that drew me to this man. The first time Kevin and I really talked was when Jacob was late at work, and I had to stay for dinner alone with his brother. Usually, such evenings passed quietly. Short phrases, delicate silence, and I had grown used to this form of communication. But that evening something changed. "Do you always cook this well?" Kevin asked when I served pasta with vegetables. His voice sounded sincere, and I felt he was truly enjoying the moment. "Sometimes when I'm not too tired," I answered with a smile that softened me a bit. What about you? Are there any dishes you can make? He shrugged, smiling, and modestly said that he usually stuck to simple things. But in that moment, I saw a warm confidence in him I hadn't noticed before. The conversation shifted to our hobbies. I told him about my love for reading and music, about how I sometimes dream of taking up painting, though I never seem to get around to it. I didn't expect him to show such genuine interest in my words. Kevin listened attentively, interjecting precise, thoughtful questions that made me feel surprisingly at ease. It felt as though he saw a new side of me, a bit deeper. I think you'd make a great artist, he suddenly said, surprising me with his unexpected certainty. You have an inner world you're trying to express even if you don't realize it yet. His words hit the mark. I wasn't used to someone, especially someone I hadn't known for long, seeing me so clearly. Jacob always supported me, but more in a cheerleading way, with warm but somewhat distant kindness. With Kevin, it was different. His support felt intentional, almost focused, as if he genuinely wanted to understand what was going on inside me. And you? I asked cautiously, sensing that something more personal was forming between us than a regular conversation. What are you passionate about, Kevin? I prefer movement, he answered thoughtfully, looking at me. Travel, sports challenges, all kinds of extreme things. He smirked as though he knew such words might sound overly serious, then added, I like it when everything around is changeable. I'm used to nothing staying the same for too long. I listened to him, feeling captivated by this way of life. Jacob and I had always sought stability and comfort, but here before me sat someone who seemed unbound to anything specific. His outlook on life wasn't superficial. I sensed he was searching for meaning in everything he did. This personal spark, the strength of his inner drive, suddenly revealed a new side of him to me. When we finished dinner, I found it difficult to admit to myself that I had enjoyed this time alone. After we cleared the table and Kevin helped me load the dishwasher, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more had begun between us than just polite cohabitation under one roof. Kevin and I started talking more often, though we tried not to show it in front of Jacob. There was nothing inappropriate in our conversations, just an exchange of opinions, views on life, and interests. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy it, as though it made him happy to see his brother and wife getting along. More than once, he mentioned how much he appreciated that we were building a connection, even joking once that Kevin seemed to be finding himself a second family. But it became increasingly difficult for me to ignore my own inner changes. Recently, Jacob had been showing me more attention, trying to spend more time with me. He arranged dinner at our favorite restaurant, brought me flowers just because. These gestures had once thrilled me, but now everything felt a bit strained, almost overdue. His attempts to bring back our closeness made me feel grateful, but something still felt missing. He was kind and caring, but I couldn't help noticing that our conversations remained on the same level. Jacob was a true partner and friend, but something had been lost. And as hard as I tried to focus on our relationship, it was difficult to forget the conversations with Kevin, his attentiveness, how he easily understood me in places where I had long resigned myself to being misunderstood. The guilt gradually filled my thoughts. I tried to convince myself that my conversations with Kevin were just friendship, that I shouldn't give it more importance than it deserved. But at times I found myself longing for another chance to be alone with him, just to talk, to discuss something personal. Each time these thoughts strayed too far, I pulled myself back, understanding that nothing should cross the line. It was too risky, and I couldn't allow myself to betray Jacob. Nevertheless, when I was alone, thoughts of Kevin would return. His gaze, his words, sometimes just the hint of something deeply personal, made me think about him again and again. I tried to push these thoughts away, convincing myself that it was just a passing reaction to having a new person in the house. The evening at the family dinner went, it seemed, as usual, but everything changed in a single moment. Kevin and I were sitting next to each other, and at one point our hands touched accidentally. Just a light touch, barely noticeable, but at that moment it felt as though it lasted forever. My heart leaped and my throat went dry. I quickly withdrew my hand, but Kevin, noticing my reaction, held his gaze on me, and it felt warmer than any open flame. Each second, I felt his intense stare. He seemed to study my reaction, as though he was trying to understand what lay behind this accident. I felt a thrill inside me, and an involuntary smile flickered across my lips, though I tried to hide it. It was more meaningful than I dared to admit to myself. His confidence, his lack of hurry, all of it contrasted with Jacob's restraint, his measured and predictable habits. Unable to handle the tension, I looked away, but the feeling of his presence stayed with me. Kevin easily and casually continued the conversation with Jacob, yet I felt that the brief moment between us resonated with something deeper than just an accidental touch. That evening, as Jacob slept beside me, I tossed and turned for a long time, replaying that accidental closeness in my mind. Why did it feel so acute at this moment? I had no answer, only those questions that surfaced over and over again. His youth, his energy, and his ability to be light and unburdened as if life had never weighed him down mesmerized me. I tried for a long time to distract myself from my growing feelings for Kevin, but thoughts of him kept coming back again and again. Everything that connected us was becoming too apparent, and I knew I needed to release this tension somehow, to divert my thoughts to something else. One evening, when the house was quiet, I registered on a dating site. It seemed like a safe way to regain some lightness, without indulging in forbidden fantasies about the person living under the same roof with us. At first it felt innocent. A few messages here and there, a light flirtation, nothing serious. I pushed away thoughts of Kevin, directing my attention to abstract dialogues with strangers who knew nothing about me. But one night, sitting with my laptop over a late dinner in the kitchen, I suddenly felt someone's gaze. Looking up, I found myself face to face with Kevin. He was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching my computer screen. I froze, realizing the chat window was still open. As soon as I realized it, a cold wave washed over me. He knew. His gaze was calm, but there was something complex hidden in that silence. "Can't sleep?" he finally asked, with a slight hint in his tone that made me tense. Kevin didn't elaborate, but the feeling that he saw more than he wanted lingered with me. His words seemed innocent, but there was something deeper and more unsettling between them. "No," I answered, trying to regain my composure and close the laptop. "Just distracting myself a bit." Kevin was silent. He stood still, but in his eyes I could see that he already understood everything. The awkwardness burned in me like a bright spotlight. I felt shamefully exposed, as if I had no protection, and even now, trying to return to a casual tone, I couldn't tear my gaze from his face. In that moment, I realized that behind his lightness and calm there was something dark, something cold that made me shrink inside. Without another word, Kevin walked to the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of water, and left for his room. But his silence, not just silence, but a hint left in the air, haunted me. It was as if he was letting me know that he understood more about me than I could have imagined, and that this knowledge was now his secret advantage. A few minutes later, I returned to my room, but the anxiety didn't leave me. What if he decided to tell Jacob everything, or worse, decided to use this knowledge to his advantage? The next morning, Kevin was waiting for me in the kitchen after Jacob had already left for work. His gaze was focused, as if he had been thinking for a long time about what to say, and had finally decided to speak. I felt a nervous anticipation as I sat down across from him, my fingers instinctively wrapping around my coffee cup, as if there was some way to shield myself from reality. "Alice," he began in a calm, even cold tone, "we need to talk about last night." I tensed, remembering the screen he had seen in front of him last night. 1,000 excuses flashed through my mind, but none seemed weighty enough. "It's just a way to distract myself," I exhaled. "Nothing serious, It was a mistake." He continued to look at me with an impassive expression that revealed only one emotion: determination. I tried to explain myself, stumbling over my words, but it seemed he was no longer willing to listen. "Jacob wouldn't like knowing what you do at night," he finally said, his words hitting me like a punch to the solar plexus. In Kevin's eyes, there was an unyielding seriousness that unsettled me. I tried to find some justification, but his gaze spoke louder than any words. There was none of the lightness and friendliness I had grown accustomed to. Instead, he looked cold and unrelenting. "But you understand that this is just—" It was a mistake. My words sounded too quiet, as if even I didn't believe them. He leaned in slightly closer, his voice almost a whisper, making the tension between us almost tangible. "I won't tell Jacob if you do one thing," he said, and his words came out as an ultimatum. My heart began to race so hard that I could barely breathe. "What exactly?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Kiss me," he said. His words were straightforward, but they carried a threat, and I suddenly realized that behind his calm face lay something darker than I could have imagined. I felt a wave of protest rise in my chest, but at the same time, something forbidden and intriguing flickered in my mind. Unable to immediately respond, I looked at him, trying to understand how serious he was. He didn't look away, and in his eyes I saw a determination that left no room to doubt his intentions. Shock, guilt, excitement, all these feelings mixed inside me, clouding my mind. I knew I couldn't afford to refuse him, and at the same time I couldn't believe that this calm, friendly person who Kevin had seemed to be was capable of taking such a step. Finally, I leaned forward, trying not to think about the consequences, trying not to let fear control me. Our lips touched, and in that moment everything froze. Guilt mingled with a sharp thrill that was impossible to ignore. I didn't know what I felt more of at that moment, shame or excitement. When I pulled away, I saw his satisfied expression and realized that I had crossed the line. After that kiss with Kevin, something in me felt unanchored and I couldn't seem to pull it back. That moment was so brief, almost fleeting, but its consequences haunted me with an intense urgency. Every time I was alone, my thoughts returned to that moment. Inside me, conflicting feelings were growing, something tangled and deep that I couldn't suppress, not even for a moment. Kevin acted as if nothing had happened, maintaining his usual lightness and friendliness, as if our kiss meant absolutely nothing to him. But I knew it wasn't the case. His glances, sometimes long, sometimes fleeting, but always full of hidden meaning, constantly reminded me of what had happened. He left subtle hints, short phrases that seemed to play just for me, stirring a storm of emotions inside me. Fear and excitement. These contradictory feelings washed over me each time he was near. I tried to keep my distance. After he demanded that kiss in exchange for his silence, I began to perceive him differently, and it gradually spoiled my view of him. His act, manipulative and unacceptable, seemed foreign, low, and every time I tried to recall my former feelings, a bitterness took over. I decided to avoid him, limiting our communication to what was necessary, refusing to give him any excuse to talk to me alone. But Jacob started to notice changes in my behavior. He asked questions that made my whole body tense. He approached, looking at me closely with a warm but attentive concern, and asked if everything was okay. "You seem a bit distant lately," he said one evening while I stared out the window, lost in thought. His words pierced me, making me feel guilt so sharply that I could barely find an answer. "I'm just a bit tired," I mumbled, trying to convince both him and myself. But Jacob could see that there was something more behind it. Deep down, I feared that Kevin might tell him about our kiss, or even hint at it if he decided to keep up his game. This thought pressed down with renewed force every time he gave me that intense, slightly mocking look. I realized he knew about my inner struggles and seemed to relish their power over me. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I had to gather all my strength to ignore his hints and reminders, to avoid reacting to his looks. But deep down, I knew that this tension wasn't going anywhere. No matter how hard I tried, it continued to build, like a storm ready to break at the worst possible moment. Kevin stood in the doorway when I returned from work, blocking my path to the living room. His look, calm and confident, spoke more than any words. I tried to pass by, but he gently placed his hand on my shoulder, stopping me. "Alice," he said calmly, but there was a note of iron in his voice that made me uneasy. "We both know this can't end with just one kiss." "Kevin, this is madness," I breathed, stepping back, but he moved closer. "Madness that you enjoy," he said with a hint of a smirk, making me nervously hold my breath. "You wanted it too, Alice. Otherwise you wouldn't have responded then." It was I started, trying to find an explanation, but the words stuck in my throat. You responded, he continued, stepping closer until there was almost no distance between us. Now I want more, right now. Jacob won't be back for a while, and I want to know that this evening will be ours. I felt fear flare inside me, but it mingled with a sharp, unwanted excitement. It was so contradictory that I couldn't think clearly. Do you understand what you're doing? I whispered, stepping away, but he didn't let me go. I understand, he said, holding me by the shoulders, and his voice was so confident that I felt my resistance melting away. The question is, what do you want, Alice? I stayed silent, not knowing how to respond, but his hands had already slid down my shoulders, leaving a heated trace on my skin. For a moment, I felt I could turn and walk away, put an end to all of this. But standing there, feeling his breath close to my neck, I realized I had already made my choice long ago. His lips grazed my neck, and a wave of warmth enveloped my whole body, erasing any will to resist. Kevin pulled me closer, his touch firm and determined, as if he knew every corner of my desire. I couldn't think of anything else but this moment, surrendering to the rising swirl of sensations, forgetting all fears and restrictions. His hands explored my shoulders, my back, and every inch of skin responded to his touch, blurring the boundaries between what I thought was right and what I actually wanted. Finally, I found the strength to pull back, catching his gaze and trying to regain control. Jacob is your brother, Kevin, I whispered, the bitterness of those words stinging my heart. Do you understand how low this is? What you're doing? He stopped, and in his eyes I saw a cold confidence that stunned me. That shouldn't concern you, he replied calmly, his voice filled with an icy determination. Or do you want me to tell Jacob everything I know? And at that moment, I understood that resistance was pointless. I had to follow Kevin's wishes if I wanted my marriage to remain intact, especially once he moved out of our home. Over time, Jacob started noticing that something had changed. His careful gaze picked up on the small things. My conversations with Kevin had become rare and tense, and the lightness between us was gone. He saw how I had grown withdrawn, how often I avoided him, and this made him more cautious. One evening, as I was walking through the living room, Kevin stopped me again in the dimly lit hallway. He was full of that confidence that had recently become a dangerous sign for me. Now, he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for requests or patience, only his usual insistence. Again? I exhaled, struggling to keep what remained of my self-control. He leaned closer, his eyes glinting, a slight smirk on his lips. Or maybe you'd rather I tell Jacob everything? He said with a hint of irony, draining my strength to argue. As if surrendering, I did what he demanded. I turned away, feeling fear swell inside me. It was drawing me in deeper, and I knew I was on the edge. Later that night, when I returned to the bedroom, Jacob was already waiting for me, and I immediately noticed the tense expression on his face. His usually warm and gentle look was now filled with suspicion that couldn't be hidden. Alice, what's going on with you? He asked directly, his voice strict but not cold. You've been acting strangely, and with Kevin, none of this is like you? His words felt like blows. With each one, I felt the fragile wall separating my secrets from his trust crumble. I stood there trying to find an excuse, but every time I opened my mouth, the words faded, as if I could no longer lie. That day, Jacob came home earlier than usual. I heard his footsteps down the hall, but it was already too late. Kevin and I were in the bedroom under the covers, and the room was filled with the inevitable sense that permeated everything with the scent of passion and excitement. When the door burst open, I saw Jacob standing in the doorway, his eyes dark as a stormy sky filled with lightning ready to strike. What are you doing?" he whispered, but in his voice there was no question, only an accusation that seemed to crush us. In a panic, I grabbed the edge of the blanket, wrapping myself up as a deep, aching sense of shame rose in my chest. Kevin tensed, but didn't say a word. The silence was deafening, and Jacob took a step closer, his gaze darting between us as though he was trying to grasp the full extent of what he was seeing. "I can't believe this," he began, his voice trembling with anger. "Alice, you… and Kevin?" His eyes clouded with hurt and disappointment. "My brother. How could you both do this to me?" He clenched his fists, and for a moment I was afraid he would give in to his anger. But Jacob took a deep breath, controlling his emotions. His voice was filled with contempt. "I won't touch you, Kevin," he said through gritted teeth, looking at us coldly. "Only because you're my brother, and damn it, I once loved you. But you're a traitor. Get out of my house. You and… Alice." His voice broke, as though it pained him to say my name. I tried to speak, still wrapped in the blanket, hoping I could somehow explain. "Jacob, it didn't start the way you think. It started with a dating site. I don't know how it got to this point." My words sounded foolish and helpless, as if I didn't believe them myself anymore. But I could see that it no longer mattered to Jacob. "It doesn't matter how it started, Alice. What matters is how it ended." He cut me off, his eyes glinting with cold resolve. "I want a divorce, and I want both of you out of my life." All I could do was watch as everything I cherished crumbled. After Jacob left, everything in the house felt drowned in dead silence. I sat on the bed looking around the room that had recently been filled with his presence. Now all these items, photos, and reminders of our life felt empty and alien. There were no justifications left. I knew I would never be able to regain his trust. Kevin tried to come over to me, softly, as though hesitating to break the oppressive silence. He sat beside me, gently touching my shoulder, but I pulled away. All I felt near him now was the pain and weight of the choices that his pressure had forced upon me. At one time, his attention had felt exciting and new, but now I saw in him only someone who hadn't hesitated to cross boundaries, exploiting my weaknesses. "Alice, I just wanted for you to feel alive," he said, his voice unusually soft, but it lacked the emotions I expected to hear. "Alive?" I laughed bitterly, not looking up from the floor. "This isn't life, Kevin. Everything we did brought only pain. You pushed me to cross a line, and now there's nothing left." I fell silent, feeling emptiness fill me inside. Something in me had broken, and now it seemed as if that had been inevitable from the beginning. Everything fell apart because I had allowed myself to give in to this fleeting passion, to let Kevin awaken something forbidden within me. And now, with everything destroyed, I knew I couldn't stay here or with Kevin. I no longer saw in him the person he had seemed to be, and I couldn't forgive either him or myself for what had happened. "I'm leaving, Kevin," I finally said, standing up and not looking at him. "This isn't the life I wanted, and it's certainly not one I could build with you." He stayed silent, understanding that there was nothing he could change. I felt like I was leaving into emptiness, where there was no hope or certainty about the future, but I knew that staying in this house meant continuing to pick up the shattered pieces of what I had destroyed myself. A few months passed, and life began to piece itself back together, albeit slowly. I left our home, our familiar paths, our past. I started from scratch, with an apartment that held no memories or evidence of Jacob or Kevin. I learned to live anew, one day at a time, trying to gather myself from the fragments that remained of my past life. Sometimes in the evenings I would visit dating sites, scrolling through pictures and profiles, searching for faces of people who knew nothing about me. It was a silly, empty habit, but in those endless profiles I hoped to find something that would fill the void within me, something that might bring a bit of relief. Strangers, flirtations, empty conversations. It all became a sort of distraction, though deep down I knew it offered no real solace. But gradually I started to understand that this emptiness was my own, and only time and patience could fill it. The love I once thought would last a lifetime turned out to be fragile and vulnerable. Yet despite everything, I realized that I could live without it, that my healing now depended solely on me. I knew I had a long path ahead, toward myself, toward forgiveness, toward a new life where I would be someone different, perhaps a bit stronger. Leaving behind all the memories, all the pain, I stepped onto that path, firmly resolved not to look back.